Okay, now I would like to take a moment just to talk about contemporary INUPIAT and more broadly Inuit life, and it's really just a few very brief notes. We'll actually kind of circle around to this topic in a couple of lectures, but for now just a few notes. Nowadays in INUPIAT life there are 13,500 INUPIAT people in Alaska, which makes them one of the larger native groups. And of those 13,500 people, 3,000 speak INUPIAT, which is speak Inuit, which is quite a few. 3,000 is a lot, especially compared to the overall size of the population being about a quarter of the population. At the same time, as noted by scholars up at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, most of those folks speaking Inuit still as kind of a primary language are over the age of 40. So that leads to concerns about language loss, not in the immediate future, but if we're thinking 30, 40, 50 years down the line, you want to make sure that younger people are speaking the language as well, and especially not just speaking perhaps little things here and there, but speaking it at least semi-fluently, so that that's being kind of transmitted in its full way through their own generation and into further generations, so that you don't have a gap in language transmission. So that's something to think about, and it's one of the reasons why, even though there are still many, many people that speak Inuit here in Alaska, why there might be certain types of like language revitalization programs going on in some places, because you're kind of looking, when you're thinking about language preservation and language revitalization, you have to be playing the long game. You have to be thinking of, again, 30 or 40 years down the road, not just what's going on currently. You kind of have to think at least 2 generations ahead, not just what's going on with the current generation of people, but whether the current generation of people will be teaching their children or their students in the next generation after that. These are some pictures from a meeting in NUNAVUT, which is a Canadian territory, which is largely Inuit people. And I share this picture mostly just to make the point that I had some earlier pictures where we were looking at, really traditional pre-colonial / early colonial Inuit forms of dress and Inuit forms of shelter. And this picture just to suggest that, it's 2020, and Inuit people, like any other people in Alaska or Canada, have buildings with lights and indoor heating and wear jeans and button-ups or whatever the case may be, just to kind of not overly exoticize other cultures than the ones that you may be used to. I also wanted to talk briefly about punk throat singing. So traditionally within Inuit culture, you have TAGAQ, which is a throat singing, which is essentially a type of singing where you do high-pitched sounds alternated with guttural throat, low resonant sounds, which sounds really cool. It gives kind of the effect of lots of people singing, and if done right, even lots of people, and sometimes it's intentionally supposed to imitate animals, so lots of people and animals singing, which is really cool. And it's traditionally a call and response game between 2 women. Typically if men are gone and sort of there's kind of a lull point in the village, not a lot's going on in the village, it would be done, and I'm calling it puzzle piece singing in the sense that if done right, TAGAQ involves 2 voices coming together like puzzle pieces, and it gives the kind of image of many voices in one with this call and response and these throat sounds. It's also incredibly difficult because you have to expel air very forcibly from your throat in a way that you don't normally do during singing, and some have said that it's sort of as much a breathing game as it is a singing game, and it's one that's likely to kind of lead to exhaustion if you don't do it right. And so it's a really interesting form of singing. And what's also interesting is that people still do it very much today, both the traditional form of it, but then you also have people like TANYA, who's an Inuit person from Cambridge Bay in Canada, and you can watch this video on your own time, and I'll have that link in the slides on Blackboard so you can go to in your own time, partly because I'm having issues having that video show up. But she does a lot of punk singing, and specifically punk singing about environmental issues, where it's very much sounds like a contemporary pop, or especially kind of a pop punk, kind of a more edgy song, but then it incorporates Inuit singing in ways that are really cool, and she's quite popular. She also has some very strong views on perceptions of Native people, and I really like this quote that she says. She says, "I find it very interesting when people vilify indigenous people that live off of the land for hunting. It's totally different when you're in nature. A wolf isn't evil for killing a caribou. It is a peaceful act and you get it done quickly. It just happens and it is just a part of life. A lot of people eat meat but would never be able to kill anything. I find that kind of disgusting. If you can't kill it, don't eat it. It represents the disconnect that makes up so many of society's problems. You don't care how many poor people picked your coffee or how many sweatshops it takes to make your iPhone." End quote. So the point, those kind of themes that she has about sort of how people perceive Inuit people, about hunting as part of the land, about relationships with animals, and the way that, as she feels, that it's become distorted over time and disconnected over time, that comes up again and again in her punk music. As we know, if you've studied punk music as a genre generally, other than just being fast-paced music that some people like to dance to or feel really hardcore if they're rebellious high schoolers, punk music actually started as, and still is for many people, a very political form of music. A lot of kind of prominent early punk bands were very political in nature, and punk throat singing nowadays is no exception. Another interesting recent development, recent sort of, for you youngins, some of you listening, this isn't going to sound really recent. It was within my lifetime, though. In 1999, they established a new territory in Canada. It was already Canadian land, but it was put off as its own territory, and that is called NUNAVUT. And NUNAVUT means our land in Canadian Inuit. And it is a territory which is to some degree Inuit run. There's a council that oversees it, representatives to the parliament, and there's Inuit people in many of the different leadership capacities. And indeed, it's about 85% Inuit people by population, about 36,000 people in the territory, and again, about 85% of those people are Inuit, and Inuit is recognized as official language within Nunavut. And the territory is about the size, just under the size of Mexico. So that was a pretty major event in terms of indigenous sovereignty and indigenous self-governance. It's not as if it's no longer colonized space. Canada still controls that land. Canada still taxes that land, but it is a area where Inuit people have traditionally more power than they would have potentially in other parts of Canada. So it's a very interesting sort of experiment in governance and policy, which is ongoing. A final point I wanted to make was about Inuit people and climate change. And I understand, of course, that climate change can be a contentious topic, and I'm not going to here kind of dive into causes of climate change or policies around climate change, but instead just kind of acknowledge a fact that for whatever reason, that I have my opinions certainly, but that we have an observation that here in the Arctic and in the subarctic, but especially in the Arctic, temperatures are increasing on average, and they're increasing much more rapidly, often twice as rapidly as they are in other parts of the world. And that's causing huge declines in sea ice melt, as you're probably familiar with. And it also causes issue in Inuit countries. And so, for example, on NUNAVUT's website, they have a whole section kind of devoted to Inuit people talking about here's some of the effects we're seeing of warming. And again, they don't get a ton into the causes so much as just there is warming and here's what it's causing. As one person, Akaluk Linge from Greenland, who's Inuit, points out, climate change is not just a theory to us in the Arctic, it's a stark and dangerous reality. And in a lot of ways, some of these Inuit communities, and in Alaska, some of these Inuit communities are particularly vulnerable to climate change in a number of ways, including the fact that when you have permafrost that starts to melt, it basically means that some of your soil's disappearing, because some of your soil was ice. And what that causes is that things like bridges and roads start to crumble, and buildings start to kind of sink a little bit. And so you have a lot of issues even before you have to worry about flooding, which is, of course, another issue. You have infrastructure that's crumbling. And, if you've ever been to parts of rural Alaska, and especially the far north in rural Alaska, it's not as if communities have unlimited funds to work with. So what this potentially means is a lot of people who don't necessarily have unlimited funds to improve their infrastructure, who then are having their infrastructure start to crumble. So climate change is an issue that's certainly on the mind of some Inuit people. At the same time, there's complicated and complex relationships there, of course, because also you have some INUPIAT groups, such as the North Slope Regional Association. I'm missaying that. Arctic Regional Slope Association. I'm missaying it. But some of the corporations who benefit from oil extraction. So I'm not implying that this is some sort of easy puzzle to solve. I'm suggesting, though, that climate change is kind of a complex issue that has to be thought of when we're thinking about Inuit people, and especially how when groups of people native or not native, but in general, when groups of people are rural, when groups of people are Arctic, when people are in the far north of Alaska, they're vulnerable in the ways that other communities in the United States aren't to rapid temperature change. Okay, well, that is what I have to share today. Thank you so much for your time.